Good afternoon, Professor and class. I'm Nabila Fika Prilita, and I'd like to present my PPT about overbuilding a game theoretic approach. The persistence of excess vacancy has long been documented in the literature. Because vacant land does not produce income, there is a tendency for developers to build whenever they can identify development opportunity. Over the past few decades, an extensive literature on the persistence of excess vacancy of property markets has been developed. The explanations for oversupply can be categorized into three groups. The first group attributes the oversupply to agency problems, irrationality, and government policies. High-income investors in the early 1980s were eager to invest in the real estate for its favorable tax advantage. The second group of arguments relies on construction lag and forecasting errors to explain oversupply and cycles. The third group of arguments relies on exercise strategies for development options to explain a developer's optimal investment decision. This paper takes a different approach, which does not rely solely on the uncertainty of future demand to develop an explanation for the oversupply phenomenon. We model developers' investment decisions in two stages. In the first stage, developers decide on the number of units to build with anticipated rental rates to be determined in the second stage of the game. In the second stage, developers will determine the rental rate based on the supply decisions they made in the first stage. The oversupply phenomenon is due to a simple fact that vacant land does not produce income. When there are a number of developers in the market and each holds enough land for development, they will compete for opportunity to develop once potential demand for space is identified. An acceptable solution seems to be that each developer builds a proportionate share of the demand. Our model also carries several testable implications that are supported by the empirical evidence reported in the literature. Our model also has some implications for general investment practices. Our conclusion that the competition for development opportunities leads to overbuilding is similar in spirit to the arguments presented by several studies addressing issues of excess capacity and inefficient use of resources. The model. Our overbuilding model can be considered as a two-stage infinite horizon non-cooperative game among developers. There are n developers in our game who hold developable sites that can be developed to meet the demand level. The game is divided into two stages. In order for developers to make the investment decision in stage 1 of the game, they will have to first anticipate the rental prices in stage 2. The framework. Consider a property market with M units of existing inventory, a vacancy rate K, and a projected incremental demand function for the next period, where R is the rental rate. When a developer decides to build, for each unit of the property, the developer incurs a constant per unit construction cost C and a per unit opportunity cost for the use of the land. Note that if a developer decides not to build, equation indicates that the profit will be a non-negative quantity. Second stage, pricing decision. The literature on static or finite horizon models indicates that causative outcomes cannot emerge in equilibrium as the result of a non-cooperative game played by maximizing developers. However, the basic insight of repeated games is that if a market situation can be repeated infinitely, the player may settle at a causative price even if they are not explicitly counting. However, in order to have positive outcomes, there must be enforceable game trigger strategies. To formalize the semi-causative model, let P denote the per period profit earned by developer and at the cost of rental price point. The solution to equation 2.5 depends on the number of units supplied by developers in the first stage of the game. To solve equation 2.5, let dr denote a downward sloping incremental demand curve. It is easy to see that in the stage 2 of the game, the market interest rate I will be fair flow, because at any given time, developers can change the rental rate of their property. First stage, investment decision. Our analysis of the second stage of the game indicates that when developers supply more units than the revenue maximizing demand, which is evaluated at the revenue maximizing rental rate, developers will not lower the rental rate to eliminate the excess supply. The next proposition details the condition under which developers in their aggregate will supply more units to the market than the demand evaluated at the revenue maximizing rental rate. This proposition indicates that in the aggregate, developers in general will supply more units than the demand level as long as N is sufficiently large or the R is small compared with M. When there is a vacant space in the existing inventory using a similar argument, equation 2.8 indicates that developers will not supply units to the market if the existing vacancy rate K is too high. This proposition states that developers in the aggregate will supply fewer units to the market than projected demand if they expect to make a higher profit from the land acquisition than from the development of the land. However, it should be noted that the conditions for an undersupply are quite restrictive. Prepositions 2 and 3 are derived under a Rake's neutrality assumption. Two intuitive explanations. Our model indicates that it is possible for us to often observe oversupplied real estate markets. The first explanation is analogous to the option to wait argument developed by McDonald and Siegel 1986. Using the option to wait concept, Grenadier proposes that because of uncertainty about future demand and the possibility of losing tenants again in the future, owners will be reluctant to lower their rent to attract tenants. By not leasing the property, owners will be able to avoid paying leasing costs again if demand or rent drops further in the future. While the argument based on the option to wait has a certain appeal, it cannot completely explain why the owner does not use a short-term leasing contract. With a leasing structure, they will pass all the leasing costs to the tenants. We develop a complementary explanation to examine the considerations from a tenant's perspective. This assumption is quite realistic as long as the current of a space meets a companies need. The company realizing that the future rent might be different from the current rent will be reluctant to increase its space significantly even if the rent level is dropping. Testable implications. While propositions 2 and 3 may be useful in explaining the frequently observed oversupply in the general real estate market, it may not be able to answer completely the question of why the magnitudes of oversupply vary in different submarkets. Proposition 4 indicates that when an individual supply decision does not affect the value of the land, the total supply to the market increases when there are more developers in the market. This proposition also carries some testable implications, holding the amount of existing inventory M constant for a given city. This proposition predicts that there will be more oversupply in suburban areas than in central business districts. This proposition predicts that holding the amount of existing inventory constant, a well-established city with less developable land should have a less serious oversupply problem than a newly developed city with abundant developable land. This proposition indicates that developers reduce their supply when the vacancy rate increases. This proposition makes intuitive sense. Developers will be more likely to supply more units if there is a larger existing inventory in the market. This proposition suggests that both the profit and cost function of the development affect a developer's decision to build. The intuition is very simple. Suppose a developer is examining the investment opportunities based on the process of land. This proposition also carries a testable implication. We know that different types of properties in general have different ratios of construction cost to land cost. Oversupply under monopoly. So far, we have demonstrated that developers, when competing for development opportunities, tend to supply more units than demanded by the market. This proposition suggests that as long as the profitability ratio is greater than the rate of increase in demand, a developer will supply more units to the market than the projected demand, even if the developer uses monopoly power. Holding everything else constant, this proposition indicates that the developer, even in a monopoly, will supply more units than the projected demand when the existing inventory is large compared to the projected demand. An extension. Our analysis so far rely on one important assumption, that there are no moving costs, so that existing tenants can move freely from existing buildings to newly constructed properties. Under this condition, the newly constructed buildings and the vacant space of existing buildings will compete for the new demand. Equation 5.3 indicates that when the profitability ratio is greater than the ratio between projected new demand and the current vacant space, a developer will supply more units to the market than the projected demand. This also makes intuitive sense if the current vacant space is much larger than the projected new demand, and if the new building cannot attract tenants from existing building, there is no incentive for developers to construct any more buildings. Conclusion. Our model demonstrates that it is natural for us to observe the recurrence of oversupply in real estate markets Because vacant land does not produce income, developers have the incentive to build once they spot a development opportunity. In a world with competition, developers will fight for any development opportunity. As a result, in the aggregate, developers will supply more units to market than the projected demand. After the market is oversupplied, developers will stop building until the demand absorbs the existing supply. Once they oversupply the units are absorbed by the new demand, overbuilding will occur again. Our model, using a very simple framework, is able to explain the long-lasting oversupply in a real estate markets without relying on the assumptions of against cost, irrational behavior, or uncertainty of demand. The implications of our model for general investment practices are worth discussing. The unique aspect of the model is that land alone does not produce income. In this regard, land can be viewed as excess capacity or as public infrastructure that can be utilized cheaply. Given this, it is reasonable to observe projects or investments with similar characteristics experiencing similar boom and bust market cycles. As an example, the establishment of the Hoover Dam provided cheap excess electricity, which is partially responsible for the establishment of the city of Las Vegas. Another example could be the recent establishment of the fiber optic cable system. With a tremendous increase in capacity, we have seen numerous developments and creations in the multimedia and internet fields to take advantage of the capacity. It would not be surprising if we find out later that a significant number of the newly developed firms do not survive for long. Yep, so that's my presentation, and I apologize for any mistakes. Thank you.